Final warning: destroying the ghost's house. In a remote village cloaked in shadows, an old woman named Martha and her son Henry decide to cut down an ancient, sinister tree growing near their home, hoping to make a profit from its wood. Despite chilling warnings from neighbors and the strange widow, Mrs. Caldwell, about the tree's connection to old graves and restless spirits, Henry dismisses their fears as superstition. But from the moment the tree is struck, unexplainable horrors begin to unfold. The air grows heavy, whispers echo in the night, and grotesque faces appear in the bark. The earth beneath the tree opens, pulling Henry into its roots as if the tree itself is alive and hungry for vengeance. Martha is left alone, haunted by whispers and unseen eyes, her sanity unraveling. On the 49th day after Henry's disappearance, villagers find her dead, her face frozen in terror as she points toward the cursed tree, which now stands unnaturally still, its branches swaying without wind. The villagers abandon the tree, terrified. Some claim to still hear Henry's desperate screams beneath the roots, but no one dares go near it again. This story serves as a chilling reminder that some forces, ancient and vengeful, should never be disturbed. Part 1. The Decision. The evening sun bled out across the sky, leaving Meadow Ridge Village cloaked in the heavy, rust-colored light of twilight. The stillness was unnatural, as if the entire world had stopped to hold its breath. Near the edge of this forgotten village stood a dilapidated cottage, its roof sagging, walls weathered, and windows murky with grime. But it wasn't the house that caught the eye, it was the monstrous tree beside it. The tree towered above the house, an ancient colossus of gnarled limbs and a trunk so wide it seemed impossible for human hands to embrace. Its bark was blackened and twisted, with veins of red coursing faintly through its surface like blood beneath dry skin. Roots burst from the ground in jagged knots, snaking like skeletal fingers into the earth and far beyond the eye's reach. For as long as anyone could remember, that tree had stood there, a grim monument to something no one spoke of aloud. Henry stood at the doorway, his tall figure darkened against the fading light. In his hand, he gripped the handle of a rusted axe, its edge freshly sharpened. Sweat trickled down his brow, but it wasn't from the summer heat. His mother, Martha, sat nearby, her frail form nearly swallowed by an old wooden chair, her knuckles white as she gripped its arms. "Henry," she said softly, her voice trembling, "you mustn't cut that tree." Henry didn't answer immediately. His gaze was fixed on the tree's shadow, stretching long and sinister across the ground, as though it were alive, as though it reached for him. Finally, he scoffed, forcing a humorless laugh from his lips. "It's a tree, Mother," he said, his voice steady but strained. "Just a tree. You can stop acting like the devil himself lives inside it. You don't understand," Martha whispered, her eyes wide and filled with something close to terror. "That tree. It's older than this village. Older than the graves, people say. Its roots go deep, Henry. Deep where no man should tread." Henry turned, anger flashing briefly across his face. "Enough of that, Mother," he snapped. "I've had enough of these old stories. That tree's wood will fetch a good price, and we need the money. You know that." "Money," Martha said bitterly, her voice rising. "What good will money do when the dead come to collect their price? Henry, listen to me. If you touch that tree, you'll wake them." Henry turned back toward the tree, squaring his shoulders. "I'll wake no one. Tomorrow, I'll fell that tree, and we'll be better for it." At that moment, a chill ran through the air, a sudden drop in temperature that sent goosebumps crawling across Martha's arms. Outside, the tree groaned softly, its limbs swaying though the air was perfectly still. Henry faltered, his hand tightening on the axe. For a moment, the two of them said nothing. The silence grew louder, oppressive, as if something unseen had entered the room. A knock at the door shattered the stillness. Both Henry and Martha jumped. The sound was sharp and deliberate, a fist pounding against wood. Henry strode toward the door and yanked it open, his jaw tightening when he saw who stood outside. It was Mrs. Caldwell. The widow lived alone at the edge of the village, in a crumbling house surrounded by overgrown weeds. She was an oddity, a woman with sharp, sunken features and dark eyes that never seemed to blink. Rumors swirled about her that she spoke to spirits, that she had seen things no mortal should see. Mrs. Caldwell, Henry said, trying to sound polite despite the irritation creeping into his tone. The old woman didn't reply. She stared past him into the house, her eyes falling on Martha, who shrank back into her chair. "You mean to cut it down, don't you?" Mrs. Caldwell said finally. Her voice was raspy and low, as though dragged across gravel. Henry set his jaw. "And if I do? It's my land. My tree." Mrs. Caldwell shook her head slowly. "That tree isn't yours. It doesn't belong to any man. Its roots drink from old bones, Henry. From them." "What are you talking about?" Henry demanded, his patience thinning. Mrs. Caldwell tilted her head slightly. The movement was unnerving, almost bird-like. "The ground remembers, boy. The things buried there. They don't sleep. They listen. They watch. And if you disturb their slumber, they will wake." Martha whimpered softly from her chair. Henry turned to glare at her, but Mrs. Caldwell's voice cut through his anger like a blade. "You think I'm mad," she said, her eyes narrowing. "Go ahead, cut it down. But when the roots come for you, when the whispers find you in the dark, you'll wish you had listened." Henry said nothing. He slammed the door in her face, the sound echoing like a gunshot. For a moment, the room was silent again, save for the faint creaking of the tree outside. Martha stared at her son, tears streaming down her face. "Henry, don't do this. I beg you." Henry turned his back to her. "It's just a tree," he muttered, though even he could hear the doubt creeping into his voice. That night the house was silent, but Henry couldn't sleep. He lay in his small bed, staring at the cracked ceiling, listening. Outside, the tree seemed louder than it had ever been, its branches creaking in slow, rhythmic groans. And then he heard it, a whisper, soft and distant like wind through dry leaves. But there was no wind. Henry sat up, his heart hammering in his chest. The whisper came again, closer this time. Henry, the voice was faint but unmistakable, spoken in a breathless, disembodied tone that made his skin crawl. He turned toward the window. The tree stood in the moonlight, its limbs unmoving, its shadow sprawling across the ground like a dark stain. But Henry could feel it watching him, waiting. He tried to shake the feeling, tried to tell himself it was his imagination. Tomorrow, he thought, tomorrow it ends. But deep in his gut, a seed of fear had been planted, and as the night stretched on, it grew. Outside, the whispers continued. Henry woke before dawn, the whisper still echoing in his ears. He rose quickly, avoiding the window. His mind was made up, though a weight he couldn't explain pressed against his chest. He picked up the axe and stepped outside into the gray, silent morning. The tree stood as it always did, motionless, ominous. Henry tightened his grip on the axe, determined to end this unease. As he lifted the blade, the wind returned, and with it, the whispers grew louder and louder. Part 2. The warning. The early morning sun pierced through heavy, low clouds, casting thin, pale streaks of light that seemed unable to reach the ground. A weight hung over Meadow Ridge Village, a stillness that stretched unnaturally across the cottages and fields, like a heavy, invisible fog. Inside the weathered Devereaux's home, Martha sat in her rocking chair, wringing her hands as though trying to scrub away her unease. The whispering from the tree last night had drained what little color remained in her face. Henry was already awake, sharpening his axe in the yard. The rhythmic scrape of metal on stone echoed across the silent property. His posture was defiant, purposeful, but Martha could see the tiredness in his eyes. Whether he would admit it or not, the whispers had reached him too. The heavy creak of the garden gate made Martha sit upright. From the kitchen window, she saw Mrs. Caldwell moving slowly up the path, her cane tapping against the dirt. Even from afar, the widow exuded an otherworldly air. Dressed in her usual black cloak and worn bonnet, she looked like a crow picking her way through a graveyard. Henry, hearing her approach, stood up and scowled. "What do you want now?" he called. His voice was steady, but it rang hollow against the quiet. Mrs. Caldwell stopped short of the yard, her sharp eyes flitting between Henry and the tree. Her lips curled into something between a frown and a knowing smirk. "You didn't sleep well last night, did you?" Henry's grip on the axe tightened. "I don't know what you're talking about. You heard them, didn't you?" Mrs. Caldwell pressed, stepping closer. Her voice was calm, almost conversational, but something dark lingered beneath her words. "The whispers. They've begun, haven't they? The tree knows what." Henry barked, though he refused to meet her gaze. "That you're going to harm it," she replied simply, as if speaking to a stubborn child. She gestured toward the tree with one bony hand. "You don't understand what you're tampering with, boy. Its roots don't just grow in the earth. They grow in the dead. That tree drinks from the graves. It remembers them. And when it's disturbed, the dead remember too." Henry forced a laugh, though there was no humor in it. "You're all insane. It's a tree, for God's sake. Not a demon, not a ghost, just roots and wood. Whatever tales you tell yourselves to keep scared little children away, I don't care." Mrs. Caldwell raised an eyebrow. "And the whisper," she said softly. Henry's face darkened. Martha, who had been watching from the window, stumbled to her feet and hurried outside. "Please, Mrs. Caldwell," Martha said, her voice trembling. "Don't make it worse." The widow ignored her, her black eyes fixed firmly on Henry. "You think it's just a tree, because that's all your eyes let you see. But there are things in this world, Henry Devereaux, that are older than men and crueler than any beast. That tree is not for you to touch. It's for the dead, and the dead do not share." Henry sneered. "I'm not afraid of stories." Mrs. Caldwell's face softened, though it was far from comforting. She stepped forward again, her voice a low, grave whisper. "Then you are a fool." The wind rose suddenly, sharp and icy, though the summer sun still hung in the sky. It tore through the yard, bending the grass and rattling the branches of the cursed tree. The sound it made was not the groan of wood, but something deeper, more primal, a growl that seemed to bubble up from the earth itself. Both Martha and Henry froze. "Do you hear that?" Mrs. Caldwell said, her voice carried unnaturally over the wind. "That's not the wind. It's them. They stir beneath your feet, Henry. They know you're here. They know what you plan to do." Enough, Henry bellowed, as if shouting would drown her words in the noise. He turned on his heel and stalked toward the cottage, his boots stomping heavily across the yard. "Take your nonsense somewhere else, old woman. I have work to do." Mrs. Caldwell did not move. She watched him with eyes that saw far more than they revealed. "Work," she murmured. "Call it what you will, Henry Devereaux. But mark my words, before this is over, that tree will take back what it's owed. And you will regret not listening to me." She turned then, shuffling back toward the gate. Martha followed after her, wringing her hands. "Mrs. Caldwell," Martha whispered urgently, her voice barely rising over the gusting wind. "What do I do? How do I stop him?" The old woman paused and looked back at Martha with something close to pity. "You can't stop him. He's made his choice. But you must prepare yourself." Martha's eyes welled with tears. "Prepare for what?" Mrs. Caldwell looked past her, to the shadow of the tree that loomed larger and darker now, as though it had grown with the warning. "For the dead," she said quietly, "because when they wake, they will come." With that, the widow disappeared down the path, leaving Martha standing alone in the yard. Henry was already inside the house, the door slammed shut behind him. But the wind still blew, and from deep within the blackened tree came the faintest sound, a whisper, carried on the breeze. It called a name. Henry. Henry sat at the table inside, his axe propped against the wall. He stared at the floor, chewing on the inside of his cheek. Though he didn't say it aloud, Mrs. Caldwell's words clawed at his mind like unseen fingers. The whispers. The roots. The dead. "Nonsense," he muttered, louder than he meant to. His voice sounded small in the silence. Outside, the tree stood still, yet Henry swore its shadow stretched a little further than before, just a little closer to the house, as if it were waiting. The whispers would return tonight. Of that, he was sure. Part 3. The first night. The night came swiftly, smothering Meadow Ridge Village in an unnatural silence. No crickets chirped. No wind rustled through the fields. The heavy air sat still as though the earth itself held its breath. Inside the Devereaux cottage, Martha sat in a rocking chair by the fire, her knitting needles abandoned in her lap. Her hands trembled slightly as she stared into the flames, their flicker offering only the faintest comfort. Henry had retired early, muttering something about an early start come morning. His axe rested by the door, gleaming in the dim firelight, but Martha couldn't take her eyes off the window. The curtains had been drawn, but she could feel the tree's shadow watching, waiting. The first sound came just after midnight. It was faint at first, a murmur, barely discernible over the crackle of the dying fire. Martha frowned, her body stiffening as she strained to hear. It could have been the wind, if there had been any wind at all. But the sound seemed to hum, rising and falling like a voice speaking just out of reach. Henry. Her breath hitched, her blood turning to ice. She shot a look toward the staircase where Henry slept, hoping the sound hadn't reached him. The whisper returned, closer this time and more distinct. A name. Martha's heart pounded painfully in her chest. Her trembling hand reached for the rosary she kept in her apron pocket, clutching it tightly as if its presence might banish the unnatural sound. She turned her head slowly toward the window, her breath shallow. The whispering grew louder, joined by something else, a rustling, like dead leaves dragged across stone. It came from outside. Martha knew she shouldn't look. Every instinct screamed for her to stay still, to not draw attention to herself. But some horrible curiosity forced her to stand, her bones creaking as she shuffled toward the window. The whispering stopped. Martha froze with her hand on the curtain, her breath caught in her throat. For a moment, the silence was worse than the sound. It was expected. Slowly, she pulled back the curtain. The tree stood where it always had, its massive branches sprawling against the night sky. But something was wrong. The branches were still too still, as though frozen in time. No wind moved them, no breeze brushed against its blackened bark. And yet, Martha swore the limbs looked different. They stretched further, clawing toward the house like reaching arms. Beneath the tree, the shadows shifted. At first she thought it was an animal, a dog perhaps. But then the shadows moved, flowing like liquid as they slipped around the roots. Shapes, figures seemed to emerge, hunched and broken, crawling through the earth as though dragging themselves free. Their forms were undefined, cloaked in shadow, but their presence was undeniable. One of them lifted its head, and Martha caught the glint of something pale teeth, a jaw unhinged as if to scream. She stumbled back from the window, her hand flying to her mouth to stifle her cry. Henry. The whisper was inside now. Martha spun toward the staircase, the firelight throwing grotesque shapes across the walls. The shadows stretched unnaturally long, twisting and writhing, as if alive. A cold gust blew through the room, extinguishing the fire entirely. Darkness engulfed her. Henry, she called, her voice cracking. There was no answer. She fumbled for a match to relight the lamp, her shaking hands betraying her. A heavy creak sounded above her, the sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving across the floorboards of Henry's room. Martha's blood ran cold. Henry, she whispered, but her voice barely carried. The footsteps stopped, and then she heard a faint scratching at the front door. Her head snapped toward the entrance, dread pooling in her stomach like ice water. The scratching continued, slow and methodical, as though someone or something was testing the threshold. Henry, wake up, she screamed. The door shuddered as the scratching turned to pounding. Heavy, deliberate knocks that rattled the wood and echoed through the house. Martha stumbled back, clutching the rosary to her chest, her whispered prayers lost beneath the deafening sound. The room felt smaller, the darkness pressing in on her from all sides. Then, as suddenly as it began, the pounding stopped. Silence returned, thick and smothering. Martha stood frozen, her breath ragged as she stared at the door. For a moment, nothing happened. And then, the handle turned. It was slow at first, a deliberate motion that sent a fresh wave of terror crashing over her. The door creaked as it opened, inch by inch, revealing nothing but blackness beyond. The night outside was deeper than any darkness Martha had ever seen, like a void waiting to swallow her whole. "Mother," the voice came from behind her. Martha whipped around, her heart slamming against her ribs. Henry stood at the top of the staircase, his hair tousled, his face pale. He blinked groggily at her, clearly just woken from sleep. "Henry," she cried, relief flooding her voice. "Something's here." "It's at the door." Henry frowned and started down the steps. "What are you talking about?" "Who's at the door?" Martha turned back to the entrance, but the door was closed. The handle was still. Nothing remained of the pounding or scratching. The fire sparked back to life in the hearth, casting flickering light across the room. It was here," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I heard it." Henry reached the bottom of the stairs and looked at her with concern. "There's no one here, Mother." "You're just imagining things." Martha shook her head violently. "No, Henry, it's the tree. I saw something under the tree. And then it was here." Henry sighed, running a hand through his hair. "You need sleep. That's all. You're letting Mrs. Caldwell get into your head." "No," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "It's not her. It's the tree. Henry, please. Don't touch it." Henry looked at her for a long moment, then turned away. "Get some rest, Mother." He picked up his axe from the corner and carried it back upstairs, leaving Martha alone in the dying light of the fire. The whispers were gone, but the silence was worse. She stared at the front door, her mind replaying what she'd seen: the shadows, the shapes, the terrible scratching. Outside, the tree stood unmoving, its branches stretched wide, as though reaching for the house. Martha stayed awake the rest of the night, clutching her rosary, her eyes fixed on the door. The whispers would come again. She was certain of it. Part 4. The workers arrive. The dawn came shrouded in gray clouds, spreading a dim and dreary light over the village. The air was cold for a summer morning, a biting chill that seeped into the bones and stayed there. Martha sat at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped tightly around a steaming mug of tea, though she barely noticed its warmth. She hadn't slept. The memory of the whispers and shadows haunted her every thought. Henry, on the other hand, moved with grim determination. He paced the yard, inspecting the tree as though sizing up a challenge. The axe sat propped against the house, its blade sharp and ready. "They'll be here soon," Henry muttered, more to himself than to Martha. "Henry," Martha began, her voice weak. "Don't do this. Please, just leave the tree alone." Henry shot her a withering glare. "Not this again, Mother. I told you already, it's just a tree. Whatever you think you saw last night, it was just your imagination. I'm done listening to ghost stories." Martha opened her mouth to argue, but the sound of wagon wheels creaking down the dirt path silenced her. She turned toward the window, dread pooling in her stomach. The workers had arrived. The wagon rolled to a halt in the yard, the horses snorting and stamping as though uneasy. 3 men climbed down, each of them rough-looking and weary, as though they'd seen their share of hard labor. The leader, a tall man with a thick beard and calloused hands, squinted at the massive tree with obvious weariness. "That's the tree?" Then he asked, his voice rough. Henry strode forward with confidence, slapping the man on the shoulder. "That's her. Big as hell, but solid wood. Good money in this one." The bearded man nodded slowly, though his gaze lingered on the gnarled roots that twisted like skeletal limbs into the earth. "She's old," he murmured, almost to himself. "Older than any tree I've ever seen." "So what?" Henry said with a grin. "More wood for us." The youngest of the crew, a lanky boy with wide eyes and nervous hands, shuffled closer to the tree. His breath misted in the unnaturally cold air, and he shivered. "It feels wrong here," the boy muttered. "Like the ground's angry enough," whining, the bearded man snapped. "We're here to work." He waved his crew forward, and the men reluctantly gathered their tools. Saws, axes, and ropes were pulled from the wagon, their metallic edges gleaming dully in the murky light. Martha watched from the kitchen window, her stomach churning with dread. The first blow came from an axe. Henry swung it with all his strength, the blade biting into the thick bark with a dull thud. The sound echoed unnaturally, as though the tree itself had absorbed it. The men hesitated, glancing at one another. "It's wood," Henry barked. "Keep going." Reluctantly, the workers began their task. Two men grabbed a heavy saw and set to work on the trunk, its jagged teeth biting through the bark with painstaking effort. The sound of sawing filled the air, a screeching, shrill noise that set Martha's teeth on edge. Then the tree groaned. It was not the sound of creaking wood. It was deeper, a noise that rose from within, vibrating through the earth. The youngest worker dropped his end of the saw with a cry, stumbling back. What the hell was that? He shouted, his voice cracking. "It's just the tree settling," the bearded man snapped, though his eyes darted nervously toward the gashes forming in the bark. Martha pressed her hand to her mouth, watching helplessly. Something thick and dark began to seep from the cuts in the tree, slowly at first, then more freely. Blood. The men froze, their tools clattering to the ground. The youngest worker pointed a trembling finger. "It's bleeding," he whispered. "God above, it's bleeding." Henry stepped forward, his face pale but resolute. "It's sap," he barked, though the words rang hollow. "It's just dark sap," but the liquid was red, thick, and unmistakable. It dripped steadily down the trunk, pooling like fresh wounds. The ground trembled beneath the men's feet, and then the birds screamed. Hundreds of crows erupted from the branches, shrieking as they scattered into the sky. Their black wings blotted out the meager light as they fled, leaving behind an eerie silence. The youngest worker let out a sob. "It's cursed," he whimpered, backing away. "We shouldn't be here. I told you we shouldn't be here." Before anyone could react, the ground split open with a deep, rumbling crack. A jagged root shot upward, wrapping around the boy's ankle like a snake. He screamed, falling to the ground as it tightened its grip, blood seeping where it pierced his skin. "Help me," he shrieked, clawing at the earth. The bearded man lunged forward, grabbing the boy's arm and yanking him free. The root snapped back into the ground, leaving a gaping hole in its wake. The men scrambled away, their faces stricken with terror. "Get to the wagon," the bearded man roared. They abandoned their tools, stumbling and shouting as they fled. Henry stood frozen, staring at the bleeding tree and the hole where the root had vanished. Martha threw open the door, tears streaming down her face. "Henry, stop this, please. Can't you see? It's alive." Henry turned toward her, his expression blank. The ground trembled beneath him, and the tree groaned again, a sound that seemed to come from the depths of the earth. The workers were gone, their wagon disappearing into the distance. The yard fell silent once more, save for the steady drip, drip, drip of blood from the tree. Martha sank to her knees on the porch, sobbing into her hands. Henry remained where he stood, his gaze locked on the tree, his face pale and unreadable. The tree's wounds continued to bleed, the crimson liquid soaking into the earth like an offering. Part 5. Henry takes over. The wagon tracks were still fresh in the dirt, but the workers were long gone. Their tools, abandoned saws, axes, and ropes, lay scattered at the base of the tree like offerings left for something dark and ancient. The heavy silence that followed their retreat was suffocating, as though the earth itself had exhaled and refused to draw breath again. Martha stood on the porch, her hands trembling as she clutched her rosary to her chest. Tears streamed down her face as she watched Henry. He stood still in the yard, staring at the bleeding tree. The red liquid oozed from its wounds, seeping into the soil in slow, steady drips. The crimson streaks glistened in the weak light, more like blood than anything nature could produce. "Henry," Martha whispered, her voice hoarse from sobbing. Please stop this. It's a warning. Can't you see?" Henry didn't answer. He just stared at the tree, his face pale, his jaw clenched so tightly that the muscles twitched. For a moment, Martha thought he might turn away, that he might finally listen to her. But then something shifted in his expression, and his eyes hardened with a familiar stubbornness. "Cowards," he muttered under his breath, his voice low and dangerous. What Martha said, taking a shaky step forward. "They're cowards," Henry said louder, turning toward her. His eyes burned with frustration and something darker, something she couldn't name. "They left because they're scared of fairy tales and shadows. It's a tree, Mother. A damn tree. and I'm going to finish what they couldn't. Martha's heart seized in her chest. No, Henry. Please listen to me. This isn't right. It's evil. Henry ignored her. He strode to the porch where his axe leaned against the wall. In one swift motion, he grabbed it and marched back toward the tree, his footsteps pounding against the earth. Henry, Martha screamed, her voice breaking. She stumbled off the porch, her hands outstretched as if to stop him. But she dared not go closer to the tree. Please, for God's sake, don't. Henry didn't stop. He stood at the base of the tree, its shadow swallowing him whole. The axe gleamed in his hands as he took a deep breath, his face twisted with rage and determination. You're just wood, he muttered under his breath. His knuckles turned white as he gripped the axe handle tighter. You're nothing. The first swing landed with a dull, sickening thud. The tree groaned. The sound was low at first, almost imperceptible, like the murmur of something waking far underground. Martha froze, her mouth open in a silent scream. She watched in horror as Henry drew back the axe and struck again. Thud, the groan grew louder. It was not the sound of wood breaking, but something deeper, more alive. It reverberated through the ground, shaking the earth beneath Martha's feet. The air seemed to thicken around her, pressing against her chest until she could barely breathe. Thud. Henry didn't stop. Each blow dug deeper into the tree's flesh, sending splinters and streaks of red flying through the air. The blood-like sap poured freely now, streaming down the trunk in rivulets and soaking the ground in dark pools. The stench hit Martha like a blow, a foul, metallic smell that made her stomach turn. Henry, stop, she screamed again. But her voice was drowned out by the groaning, a sound that had become a wail, rising and falling like a chorus of voices crying out in agony. The sky darkened. Clouds, black and heavy, gathered above the house, swirling unnaturally fast. The light dimmed until the yard was cloaked in shadow, though the sun had not yet set. A chill swept through the air, biting and cruel, as though winter had descended in an instant. Henry paused, the axe raised high above his head. He was breathing hard now, his chest rising and falling as he glared at the tree. For a moment it seemed as though he might stop. But then the ground beneath him trembled, and the roots of the tree began to move. They writhed. Martha gasped, her knees threatening to give way. The roots, thick and gnarled, twisted and coiled like serpents, slithering through the earth. Some rose above the ground, curling toward Henry as though reaching for him. He staggered back a step, his face pale, but the stubbornness in his eyes burned brighter than ever. No, he growled. You don't scare me. He swung the axe again. The moment the blade struck, the ground buckled. A low, shuddering crack echoed through the yard, followed by a sound so terrible it made Martha's blood run cold. It was a scream, a human scream, as though something alive inside the tree had been mortally wounded. Henry stumbled backward, the axe slipping from his hands and thudding to the ground. He looked up at the tree, his eyes wide, his face ghostly pale. The roots surged toward him now, faster, more deliberate, tearing through the earth with sickening cracks. Henry, run, Martha shrieked, her voice raw. But Henry didn't move. He stood frozen, his gaze locked on the tree as its roots stretched toward him. The air was filled with the sound of the groaning, the wailing, a cacophony of pain and rage. The clouds above split open, and a torrent of icy rain began to fall. It soaked the ground, turning the dirt to mud, but the red sap, the blood, continued to seep from the tree, mixing with the rainwater until the ground ran crimson. Martha fell to her knees, her tears mixing with the rain as she sobbed. Henry, please. Come back at last. Henry turned toward her, his face streaked with water and sap, his eyes hollow. For a moment he looked as though he might say something, but then the roots snapped around his ankles. Henry screamed. The sound cut through the storm as the roots dragged him down, pulling him toward the base of the tree. He clawed at the earth, mud caking his fingers, but it was no use. The roots coiled tighter, dragging him inch by inch into the gaping maw that had opened between the tree's roots. Henry, Martha screamed, crawling toward him, but it was too late. With one final, wrenching motion, the roots yanked Henry beneath the ground. The earth closed over him, swallowing him whole. The screaming stopped, replaced by silence, a silence so deep it seemed to suffocate the world. The rain slowed. The clouds began to disperse, and the sun's dying light spilled over the yard once more. Martha lay in the mud, shaking, staring at the spot where her son had been. The tree stood tall and still, its bark slick with red. Its shadow stretched long across the ground, darker and deeper than before, as though it had grown. And in the silence, Martha heard it again, a whisper carried on the wind. Henry. Part 6. The tree strikes back. The storm clouds hadn't fully passed when Henry's rage took hold. The ground was wet with rain, the mud a sickly red where the tree's blood, like say, mixed with water. Martha watched helplessly from the porch as Henry, soaked and shaking, picked up the axe once more. His face was pale, but his eyes burned with defiance, a man too stubborn to admit he was afraid. Henry, no, Martha cried, her voice raw. Please, I'm begging you. Henry didn't hear her or chose not to. He stalked back toward the tree, his boots squelching in the mud. The massive trunk loomed over him, its black bark slick with the tar-like sap that still oozed from the wounds he had already carved. The red streaks had spread, creating jagged patterns that almost looked like veins. He swung the axe. The blade bit deep into the tree, and this time, the tree screamed. It wasn't the groan of wood under pressure. It wasn't even the wail of something alive. It was worse, a chorus of voices, shrill and anguished, crying out as one. Martha clutched the porch railing, her knees threatening to buckle as the sound tore through her mind. Henry, stop, she screamed, but her voice was drowned out. Henry drew back the axe, his teeth gritted, and struck again. From the new wound, the tar-like substance didn't drip, it gushed. It oozed out in thick, bubbling streams, pulling around the roots. Henry stumbled back as the dark liquid splashed against his boots. The smell hit him then, sharp and fetid, like rotting flesh mixed with rusted iron. He gagged but didn't let go of the axe. It's just sap, he muttered to himself, though his voice trembled. And then he saw the faces. The bark where Henry had struck began to change. It rippled and twisted, the patterns in the wood warping into grotesque shapes. Eyes, dozens of them, opened along the trunk, unblinking and black as voids. Mouths followed, forming where the bark split. They stretched wide, screaming silently, as if their agony had been etched into the tree itself. Some of the faces looked human, others did not. Henry froze. The axe slipped from his fingers, landing with a muffled thud in the mud. Mother, he whispered, his voice choked. Martha could only stare, her mouth open in horror. Her hands clutched her rosary so tightly it cut into her skin. Henry, come back. Please, her voice was barely a whisper. The ground rumbled. Henry looked down just in time to see the roots move. They surged upward with terrifying speed, writhing and snapping like serpents. One wrapped around his ankle, its rough bark biting into his skin. He cried out, trying to shake it off, but another root coiled around his other leg, dragging him down. No, Henry screamed. He clawed at the mud, his fingers sinking deep, but it was useless. The roots tightened like living chains. Henry, Martha shrieked, stumbling off the porch and into the yard. She could barely see through her tears, her feet slipping in the muck as she ran toward him. The roots pulled harder. Henry was dragged down to his knees, the mud swallowing him up to his thighs. He beat at the roots with his fists, his face twisted in panic. Help me, he screamed, looking toward his mother. Mother, help me. Martha fell to the ground just feet away, her outstretched hands grasping at nothing. I'm coming, Henry. I'm coming, but it was too late. The ground split open beneath Henry, a jagged maw of darkness that yawned wide, as though the earth itself had come alive. The roots dragged him down further, his arms flailing as he fought to pull himself free. The faces on the tree watched him, their mouths contorted in silent screams. Mother, Henry's voice cracked as his head was pulled closer to the earth. His eyes were wide with terror, his face smeared with mud and sap. Mother, please. Martha screamed his name over and over, but her words were drowned out by the sound of the wind, a terrible, howling wind that seemed to rise from the tree itself. The ground trembled violently, shaking the cottage, the yard, everything. A deep groan echoed from the roots as they pulled Henry into the blackness. And then, he was gone. The earth slammed shut as suddenly as it had opened, leaving no trace of Henry behind. The wind died, and the world fell eerily still. The tree stood silent and unmoving, its bark smooth once more, as if nothing had happened. The only sign of Henry's struggle was the abandoned axe, half buried in the mud. Martha collapsed to her knees, her body shaking with sobs. Her hands clawed at the dirt where Henry had vanished, her cries breaking the unnatural silence. "Henry," she whispered, rocking back and forth. "My boy. My Henry." She lifted her head to look at the tree, and for a moment she thought she saw his face in the bark. His eyes wide and pleading stared back at her, his mouth open in a silent scream. Then the face rippled and vanished, swallowed by the tree's shadow. Martha scrambled backward, her chest heaving. The tree loomed larger now, its branches stretching wider as though it had fed on Henry's life. Its shadow darkened the yard, a black stain that crept closer to the house. From somewhere deep within the tree, a whisper carried on the wind. "Henry," Martha screamed, the sound ripping from her throat as she stumbled toward the house. She slammed the door behind her, locking it as though that could keep the tree at bay. She backed away, clutching the rosary to her chest, her eyes fixed on the window. Outside, the tree stood still, but its shadow seemed to shift, creeping closer. Martha fell to the floor, sobbing. The house was silent, except for the sound of her own breath. And then, faintly, the whisper returned. "Henry," it was louder now. That night, the house was heavy with silence. Martha huddled in the corner of the living room, clutching a blanket around her shoulders. She hadn't lit a fire. She hadn't moved since she bolted the door. All she could do was listen. The tree was waiting. She could feel it, a presence just beyond the walls, pressing in on all sides. The whispers were back now, slithering through the cracks in the wood, curling around her ears like snakes. Henry. Martha rocked back and forth, muttering prayers under her breath, tears streaming down her face. But no prayer could reach her here. Not anymore. Outside, the tree's shadow stretched across the ground, reaching toward the house as though it too wanted to finish what it had started. Part 7. The Aftermath. Martha woke with a start, her body stiff and cold from where she had collapsed on the living room floor. Her blanket had fallen away in the night, leaving her exposed to the chill that crept through the house. For a moment she lay still, disoriented, the events of the night before clinging to her mind like a fever dream. Henry, the memory hit her like a fist to the chest. Her breath caught as she scrambled to her feet, her hands trembling as they gripped the edge of the table for balance. She stumbled toward the window, her heart thudding painfully in her chest. Outside, the yard was eerily still. The tree stood exactly as it had, towering, blackened, and unnaturally quiet. Its twisted branches reached upward like skeletal arms, silhouetted against the pale morning sky. The ground around it was smooth once more, as though nothing had ever disturbed it. But near the base of the tree, something caught Martha's eye. Henry's axe. It lay abandoned, half buried in the dark, sodden earth. Beside it, the soil was darker than anywhere else, a deep, reddish-brown patch that looked freshly turned, like a grave. "No," Martha whispered, pressing a hand to her mouth. No, 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 her knees buckled, and she sank to the floor, tears spilling down her cheeks. "Where is he?" Her mind screamed the question over and over, but no answer came. The silence outside was unbearable, a heavy, unnatural stillness that pressed against the windows and walls of the house. Even the birds refused to sing, their absence making the world feel empty and dead. The village noticed Henry's disappearance almost immediately. It was a small place, after all, where everyone's business was everyone's concern. The whispers started that same day, spreading like wildfire from one house to the next. "Henry Devereux's gone," said old Mr. Phelps, the blacksmith, as he leaned against his forge. "Gone?" asked the butcher, his cleaver pausing mid-swing. "Where to?" Mr. Phelps shook his head gravely. "No one knows. His mother says he vanished." And the tree he trailed off, his voice dropping to a whisper. "That cursed tree. It's still there, it's always been there," the butcher replied, uneasily. "And it'll outlast all of us," Mr. Phelps muttered darkly. Martha didn't leave the house. She couldn't. The whispers followed her everywhere now, curling around her like mist. At first they were faint, no more than soft breaths against her ear. But as the days dragged on, they grew louder. Henry, the sound came from the tree. She knew it did. Each night she watched from the window as the tree's shadow stretched across the yard. It was longer, now deeper, as though the tree itself had grown in the days since Henry vanished. Its branches clawed at the sky, unmoving, even when the wind blew. The earth beneath it was black and slick, the red stains of sap still visible against the roots. On the third day, Martha swore she saw movement. She had been staring at the tree, watching, waiting, hoping for something she couldn't name. And then, for just a moment, she saw it. The ground beneath the tree rippled, like water disturbed by a stone. The soil moved, shifting outward before settling again. A low groan echoed faintly on the wind, so deep she felt it in her chest. "Henry," she whispered, pressing a trembling hand to the glass. "Henry, is that you?" The tree didn't answer. But the ground was breathing. By the end of the week, the whispers had turned to rumors. The tree took him, the younger villagers said in hushed voices, their eyes darting toward the Devereaux house, as though even speaking of it might bring the tree's attention. "It's hungry," others added, crossing themselves as they spoke. "And it's fed now." But for how long, no one dared approach the Devereaux property, though many villagers passed by on the road, watching from a distance. Children were warned to stay far away. Some of the older men muttered about burning the tree down, make sure it's dead, once and for all. They said, but no one seemed brave enough to try. At night, the whispers traveled further. People claimed they heard voices on the wind, a chorus of wails that rose and fell like a funeral dirge. And always among them, one voice stood out. "Henry, on the seventh day, Martha went outside." She hadn't stepped beyond the door since the night Henry vanished, but something compelled her now. She walked slowly across the yard, her bare feet sinking into the damp earth. The sky was gray, the air heavy and damp. Each step felt harder than the last, as though the earth itself wanted to keep her back. The axe was still there, exactly where Henry had dropped it. The handle was slick with mud, its blade stained dark red. She crouched down and picked it up, her hands shaking as she turned it over. "Henry," she whispered, her voice trembling. The tree loomed over her, its shadow stretching far and wide. Up close, the bark looked darker than ever. The patterns twisted into shapes she dared not look at too closely. Her heart pounded as she forced herself to step closer. She reached out a trembling hand, her fingertips grazing the bark. It was warm. Martha jerked her hand back, gasping. The whispers rose around her, swirling through the air like wind through dry leaves. The earth beneath her feet shifted slightly, the roots pulsing faintly, as though alive. "Henry," she choked out. For a moment she thought she saw a face. His face. It formed just beneath the bark, his wide, terrified eyes staring back at her. His mouth opened as though to scream, but no sound came out. Martha stumbled backward, dropping the axe as she clutched her chest. The face faded, swallowed back into the wood, and the whispers grew louder. "Henry!" Martha turned and ran, tears streaming down her face. She didn't stop until she was back inside. The door slammed and locked behind her. She sank to the floor, sobbing into her hands as the whispers crept through the walls. Outside, the tree stood silent, but its roots spread deeper, and its shadow stretched further, hungry, patient, and growing. Part 8. Martha's madness. The days turned to weeks, though time had lost all meaning within the walls of the Devereaux house. The once cozy home had become a tomb, its air heavy with silence and dread. Dust settled on the furniture. The curtains remained drawn, and the rooms grew dark as though the very light feared to enter. The house's heart, the laughter, the chatter, Henry's booming voice was gone, replaced by whispers that slithered through the cracks. Martha moved like a ghost, drifting aimlessly from room to room. Her hair had turned thin and tangled, her once strong hands trembling as they clutched at her rosary or wrung the edges of her dress. She no longer ate. She barely slept. When she did, it was to wake in terror, drenched in sweat, the whispers echoing in her ears. It was always the same word, Henry. The voices were everywhere now. They rose from the walls, crept through the floorboards, and seeped from the cracks in the ceiling. They hissed and murmured, soft and taunting, never loud enough to fully understand but always close enough to hear. At night, they grew bolder, louder, an endless litany that called to her, tempting her to listen. Martha tried to drown them out. She stuffed rags into her ears, smashed plates to create noise, and muttered prayers to herself in rapid, breathless chants. "God, protect me," she whispered over and over, her voice cracking. "God, save me. Deliver me from evil. Deliver Henry. Deliver Henry," but God wasn't listening. Only the tree was. On the 10th night, Martha awoke to a faint tapping. At first, she thought it was her imagination, another trick played by her fevered mind. But the sound came again, rhythmic and deliberate. Tap, tap, tap. She sat up, her breath catching in her throat. The room was pitch black, the air thick with the musty smell of old wood and damp earth. She strained her ears, hoping the sound would stop. It didn't. The tapping came from the window. Martha's heart raced as she turned her head slowly toward the sound. The curtains were still drawn, but the silhouette of the tree's branches was visible, black against the faint glow of the moon. The tapping continued. Tap, 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 dash, dash, as though one of the branches had grown long enough to reach the glass. "No," Martha whispered, clutching the blanket to her chest. "You stay away. You stay away." The tapping stopped. For a moment, the silence returned, heavy and suffocating. Martha sat frozen, her heart pounding in her ears. Then, from behind the curtain, she heard it. Henry. The voice was faint but unmistakable, as though it came from just outside the window. Her breath hitched. She knew it couldn't be him. It couldn't be, but the voice sounded so much like her son. Desperate. Pleading. "Mother, let me in," Martha screamed. She bolted from the bed, stumbling in the dark as she grabbed for the door. The voice followed her, growing louder as though the tree itself were crawling toward her. "Mother, help me." She ran to the living room, falling to her knees in front of the cold, dead hearth. Her hands clutched at her hair as she rocked back and forth, tears streaming down her face. "Leave me alone," she sobbed. "Leave me alone. Henry's gone. He's gone." The voices didn't stop. They swirled around her, growing louder and more chaotic whispers, groans, cries, a chorus of pain and hunger that rattled her very bones. Shadows danced on the walls, twisting and writhing like living things. The tree's presence pressed against the house, squeezing it tight like a predator waiting to strike. Martha collapsed, exhausted and broken. The voices faded to a murmur, but one whisper lingered close to her ear. Hungry. By the 12th day, Martha had stopped trying to fight. She sat in her rocking chair by the window, staring blankly at the tree. Her eyes were sunken, ringed with dark bruises. Her lips moved constantly, murmuring words no one else could hear. She no longer reacted to the whispers. They had become part of her, a constant companion that filled the silence left by Henry's absence. "The tree is hungry," she muttered, her voice thin and broken. "It fed once, but it's not enough. It's never enough." She rocked back and forth, her hands trembling in her lap. Outside, the tree loomed larger, its branches stretched wide as though embracing the house. Its roots bulged against the earth, pressing closer to the foundation with every passing day. At night, Martha swore she could hear it breathing. On the 14th day, someone knocked at the door. Martha didn't move. She couldn't. She just stared at the tree, her lips still moving in a silent chant. The knocking came again, louder this time. "Mrs. Devereaux," it was a man's voice, one of the villagers. "Are you in there? It's been weeks. Please, open the door." Martha turned her head slowly, her gaze dull and unfocused. The voice was real, but it seemed so far away, as though it belonged to another world. "Mrs. Devereaux, we want to help." The knocking stopped. A heavy silence followed, broken only by the faint sound of the wind outside. Martha turned back to the window, her gaze fixed on the tree. The shadows beneath it seemed darker now, deeper, as though the earth itself had been hollowed out. She smiled faintly, her cracked lips curling upward. "It's hungry," she whispered to no one. "And it's waiting outside." The tree's shadow stretched across the yard, creeping closer to the house with each passing moment. Its roots pulsed, shifting just below the surface like veins beneath skin. Martha rocked in her chair, her eyes glazed and vacant, her voice little more than a hum as she spoke the words again and again. "The tree is hungry. The tree is hungry. The tree is hungry." Part 9. The final day. The 49th day dawned gray and still. A thick fog rolled in from the fields, wrapping the Devereux house in a shroud of gloom. Not a single bird sang, not a breath of wind stirred the grass. It was as though the world itself knew what lay within. The villagers had avoided the property for weeks. No one dared to approach the cursed house, not after the rumors had taken root. Whispers of Henry's disappearance, of the voices in the night, of the tree's hunger had spread like wildfire. Those who lived closest claimed to hear screams on the wind, low and anguished cries that rose from the earth itself. It was old Mrs. Caldwell who finally convinced two men to go. "The woman's gone mad," she said, her voice gravelly and urgent. "If she hasn't starved. The tree. The thing has claimed her, just like it did her boy." And so two reluctant villagers made the journey. They arrived just as the sun began to break through the fog, their wagon creaking along the overgrown path that led to the Devereux home. The air grew colder the closer they came, and the house itself loomed like a shadow in the mist. The grass around the house was dead. Blackened patches marred the yard, spreading outward from the tree like veins of decay. The house itself seemed to sag under the weight of something unseen, its walls warped, its windows dark and hollow, like empty eyes. When they knocked at the door, there was no answer. Mrs. Devereux, one of the men, called, his voice muffled by the unnatural quiet. The door, unlocked, creaked open at the slightest push. The house smelled of rot. The air was stale and cold, carrying the faint metallic scent of something long dead. Dust blanketed the furniture, and the silence pressed down on the two men like a physical weight. They stepped cautiously into the living room, their boots leaving faint imprints on the dusty floor. That's where they found her. Martha sat in her rocking chair by the window, her body stiff and still. Her face frozen in an expression of pure terror was turned toward the glass, her mouth open as though she had been mid-scream. Her eyes, wide and unblinking, stared blankly ahead, her hand outstretched toward the window as if reaching for something. The men staggered back, their faces pale. "Dear God," one of them whispered, crossing himself. But their eyes followed hers. They couldn't help it. Slowly they turned to the window. Outside, the tree stood tall and monstrous. Its branches stretched wide as though it were basking in some invisible light. The limbs swayed ever so slightly, though the air outside was still and heavy. The ground around its base was dark and slick, the earth rippling faintly, as though it had been disturbed. "We shouldn't be here," the other man said, his voice shaking. "We need to go now." But neither man could move, for as they stared at the tree, they swore they heard something faint and muffled, as though it came from deep below the earth. A scream. Henry's scream. It rose, building into a wail that twisted and echoed, growing louder and louder until it filled the men's ears, rattling their bones. They turned and fled from the house, stumbling over each other in their haste to escape. The door slammed shut behind them, as though the house itself wanted them gone. By the end of the week, the villagers abandoned the property entirely. No one would go near it. They refused to speak of what had happened, but their silence was loud, filled with terror and certainty. The men who had seen Martha swore never to return, and Mrs. Caldwell's warnings spread through Meadowridge like plague. It took them both, she said to anyone who would listen, her eyes sharp with a terrible knowing. The tree fed, and now it's quiet again. But not for long. The Devereux house became a place of whispered stories, a cautionary tale for children who didn't listen, a ghost story for those brave enough to speak its name. The windows were boarded up, the door locked tight, but no lock could keep the whispers inside. They said the screams never truly stopped. Late at night, when the village was still and the wind was quiet, some claimed to hear them. Henry's voice, rising from the roots of the earth, crying out for release. "Mother, Help me, no one dared approach the tree again. It loomed over the abandoned house, its roots spreading further each year, as though consuming the land around it. The branches seemed darker now, thicker, as though fed by something that could never be replaced. And yet, it swayed. Even when the air was still, the tree swayed. By spring, the rumors grew worse. A traveling merchant claimed to have glimpsed something in the bark, a face, frozen in agony, its mouth twisted in a silent scream. A group of children dared one another to venture near the house, but none made it past the front gate. They said the air turned cold, and the ground seemed to whisper beneath their feet. The villagers stopped walking near the Devereaux property altogether. They spoke of the tree as though it were a living thing, a predator watching, waiting. The road leading to the house grew over with weeds, the land swallowing it as though it had never been. On moonless nights, those who lived closest said they could see it. The shadow of the tree stretched far beyond its roots, black as ink, covering the fields like a stain that could not be scrubbed away. And sometimes, when the village was quiet enough, when even the dogs refused to bark, they heard it, a muffled cry, rising from deep below the earth. Henry screamed. Years passed, but the tree remained. The house rotted into the ground, its roof caved in and its walls crumbling. But the tree stood strong, its bark blacker than ever, its roots twisting like veins beneath the soil. The land around it turned barren, unable to bear life. Nothing grew. Nothing lived. No one ever dared to cut it down. No one dared to test it. And those who passed by, those who risked a glance at its branches, swore they saw it move. The tree was waiting, watching. It never let go. It was hungry, and it would wait for as long as it needed.